Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this Use My Data webinar. My name is Chris Carrigan, and I'm the data advisor to Use My Data and part of the secretariat which supports Use My Data. Just by way of background, Use My Data is a movement of patients, relatives, and carers. It's the only UK independent movement of patients, relatives, and carers focused on the use of patient data to save lives and improve outcomes. Use My Data engages positively with a wide range of stakeholders around the ways that our patient data is managed and it's used, including through webinars like this. For those that have joined who may not be familiar with the webinar format, you'll see that your microphones and your cameras are disabled. You should still be able to see and hear our panelists on the screen. Hopefully that's all working for everybody. Could I just ask all the delegates, please use the Q&A function throughout the session. At the bottom or tops of your screens, depending on your device, you'll see a Q&A button. If you use that and watch that, use that to put in your questions as they arise. Just enter them in so you don't forget them. Everybody will be able to see all the questions as they're typed in. So if you could keep an eye on the Q&A box and you see a question that somebody else has asked that you think is important, you can vote up that question. You can vote up more than one question. I'll be putting your questions directly to our panelists during the session, according to the votes it receives. I should just note that we're recording the webinar today. You'll have seen that and heard that when you logged in. And we'll have this on the Use My Data website as soon as we can afterwards, along with highlights of the key points, and particularly some of the actions that we need to follow up, which hopefully will come out as a result of this webinar. Feel free to use any social media throughout. If you'd like to tweet, please tag @UseMyData and use the hashtag #DataSavesLives, which is a very common hashtag being used across a range of different initiatives. As is usual with our webinars, we have a very mixed audience today of patients, carers, relatives, NHS, academia, commercial companies, and more. The topics for all Use My Data events are defined and agreed by its members, patients, relatives, and carers, not me. And the theme for today's webinar isn't actually that new to some of them. Back in October 2013, NHS England originally set out some intentions to link data for the first time from different NHS providers spanning primary and secondary care, GPs and hospitals, supporting studies that identify patterns in diseases, responses to treatments, and the effectiveness of different services. And however well-intentioned the concept, by a year afterwards, ministers actually halted the programme following several media stories about data being sold and amidst concerns about lack of awareness, lack of consultation, lack of clarity about how the data would be used. The reason I mention that is that by around 2015, around 1.5 million patient records were flagged as wanting to opt out of this process. And the loss of public trust, the negative media coverage, and the huge risk aversion by data controllers saw data access for researchers grind to a near halt or an actual halt in some cases. In fact, that was the catalyst for the formation of Use My Data. Data access for cancer research had effectively stopped, but researchers needed to use the data and patients wanted their voices to be heard to get the data used for the right reasons with the right safeguards. So today we want to talk about a new initiative to better coordinate, link, and utilize our patient data, the GP data for planning and research, GPDPR, which I will stumble across several times today. Our members were concerned about recent media coverage from several aspects, that it was largely negative, that the potential benefits and safeguards hadn't really been described, that it caught them by surprise a bit, and that in particular they wanted to know more so that they could make their voices heard individually and collectively in a much more informed manner. In fact, just checking this morning, it seems that because of the media and the way this story is panned out, I think there's been 100,000 new national data opt-outs in the last month. So clearly people out there have questions and concerns, which we need to understand. And that's what today's webinar is intended to do. We want to hear your questions, your concerns, your suggestions, and we'll be putting these to the panel today. And most of all, we want to see if we can come up with a series of steps or actions that you would like to see to move the programme forward. So to start, let me introduce the panel. The panel today we have Phil Booth, who's the hi Phil, who's the coordinator at Med Confidential, who's just rapidly joined us from another meeting. We've got Dr. Nicola Byrne, the National Data Guardian, Dr. Arjun Dillon, the Colleague Guardian at NHS Digital, Professor Mark Lawler, the Scientific Director for DataCan, which is an HDR UK hub for cancer, John Marsh, who's a patient and a member of Use My Data, and Jeff Schrecker, who's a retired GP retired chair of the EMIS National User Group, a deputy chair of IGARD, the Royal College of GPs Clinical Champion for Patient Data Choices. IGARD is the group which oversees releases from NHS Digital. EMIS is one of the GP systems providers. We've asked all our panelists to avoid acronyms, as I just didn't, and to speak in plain English and to focus on a patient audience. So if there are things you don't understand, including things I say, please just tell us using the Q&A function, and I will keep an eye on those things as we go through. First of all, we want to ask you a few questions, which we'll do by using the polling function. We're going to use this throughout the webinar. In a few seconds, you'll see some questions pop up on your screen to which we'd like your response. So if I can pull my polls up and organize that for us. The first question, is how did you hear about GDPR? GPDPR, there you go, I told you I'd do that. How did you first hear about this GPDPR program? I'll let that poll run for a few seconds. If you just enter your comments in there. Of course, me seeing this screen, I don't know whether people are seeing the poll results coming in. So I'll leave it a second. I'm sensing. Okay. Now hopefully when I end this poll, somebody's also put through word of mouth. Yeah, there may be things we didn't cover in here. We put the other in there. Share results. So that should now share on your screens. Can people see that? And I think it's pretty clear. You would expect some people on this in this audience to have heard from Use My Data, which I think we've reflected there. But the bulk of this came from media, or indeed other. I noticed somebody said other was word of mouth. They'd heard from a friend of a friend, if you like. I suppose the thing we could note from that is this the best way to manage information going out to the public for such an important program? I think that we can maybe pick up on that as part of the webinar. Okay, there was another question I was going to ask you, which was, secondly, which I'm trying to do, I can't. There we go. Which was, this is the problem with trying to do Zoom at the same time. Launch, which is about your level of understanding, given what you have been able to read, either through the media or through different routes. How useful was that as a starting point? And we're going to ask this towards the end as well, to see if this webinar, frankly, has helped in any way. So I'll let that run for a few seconds. That's nearly half of you voted. Other votes coming in. Just another few seconds. This is more interesting for me because I can see the votes coming in. Sorry about this, folks. Okay, we're going to end the polling there. Hopefully people can see that on a scale of 1 to 5. Very few obviously have got complete understanding, very few have got no understanding, that we're in the middle somewhere, which is, I think, not surprising. Again, we will try and run this towards the end to see whether that's changed or not. Okay, stop sharing the results. The other question we were asked is when we were putting this together is, I mentioned the point about 100,000 new people have opted out of this. And one poll we were asked to put in here, which I've just launched now, was about that question. Have you opted out of your data being collected as part of this program? There's a yes and no. There's a no, but planning to, no, but not made a decision. And there's also one on the bottom about to see if people had already opted out through the national data opt-out. I know this is not a perfect question set to have, but we just thought that would be interesting. Okay, that's nearly all people in. A few more trickling in.
Sorry, Chris, the poll is so poorly formed. The national data opt-out does not prevent your data from being collected.
We'll come to that.
NHS Digital has said that explicitly.
Yeah, we're going to come to that in a second, Phil, because that was one of the points I wanted to follow up on this particular point about opt-out. Don't worry. And I take the point about the poll not being perfectly formed. If the polls are not accurate, we won't use them, but we were asked to put this one in. Oops. Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we dropped the polls there. Thank you for that. The other thing you'll have noticed is we've got another name on the panel called Dave Roberts. And to start the webinar off, Dave Roberts from NHS Digital has offered to come and speak to us about setting the scene. So what we thought was really important for people to get hold of was where we are at the minute with the programme, where it's come from, what its aims are, and with the best, the suggestion was given to us, we could get somebody from NHS Digital to give us that presentation. So Dave has offered to give us his overview of the programme, after which we want to begin to put your questions to the panel, including some things about the opt-out, which Phil has flagged up. So just a reminder, keep the Q&A on your screens. If you see people's questions you want to be asked, vote them up. If you want to enter your own, please do that at any point. Dave, let's start, if we could, by asking you to set the scene for the GP DPR program. I shall share screen here, hopefully, and hopefully people will be able to see the PowerPoint slides. And hopefully people can see that. Dave, I'll let you take the floor now, if that's all right.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for inviting us onto this. I think it's a really good opportunity for us to outline the general practice data for planning and research. If you want to go straight to the next slide, Jeff. So what I wanted to do initially was just to show what the benefits of GP data are. And also to say that we have been collecting and sharing general practice data for a number of years already. So these are not taken from, obviously, the new collection, which is yet to start, but I thought it was useful just to show you the power of sharing GP data. I've given a few examples here of the pandemic, and certainly in terms of the Oxford University Recovery Trial, which actually shows that we can save lives by sharing this data, which was crucial in identifying that dexamethasone could treat patients with COVID. One of the other major things we've used GP data for is with a variety of other data sets to develop the shielded patient list. I was interested to see that we've now been collecting and maintaining and producing the shielded patient list for over a year, and continue to do that if that's required in the future. And obviously that helped us to identify the people to be at most at risk or vulnerable to COVID-19, so that there could be several services put in place for those individuals to benefit from that. Also, in terms of vaccine prioritization, you will know that there were various groups or priority groups for vaccination. And it was important to recognise again that there were some that should be high priority because of their clinical vulnerability. And again, we use data from general practice in order to identify those individuals. And again, we continue to supply that to the vaccine system in order to ensure that all those patients have been vaccinated, not just once, but twice. The other one that I thought I'd mention was around long COVID. Obviously that's an issue, and the reason I've introduced that one is because this shows the continuing need for GP data to get us through the pandemic and post-pandemic, and this is one of the main areas of concern in terms of long COVID that you will all be aware of from the news. Next slide, please, Jeff. A really brief history, but again, really to show the audience that we have been collecting data for some time. We had what's called the General Practice Extraction Service that I helped introduce along with Arjun around 10 years ago, and that was specifically designed to start collecting data with BMA and RCGP, the two professional bodies, and apologies, I've already used an acronym, the British Medical Association and the Royal College of General Practitioners, who supported us in introducing a collection. And as it says there, that's been operating for over 10 years. And in addition to the benefits that I showed on the previous slide, what that's done is also look at diabetic retinopathy, which is a way of testing patients with diabetes and giving them eye tests because they can be compromised by eye deterioration. And also we've done some work around learning disabilities, people with learning disabilities, and showing the disparities between the care provided, again by collecting GP data. The main problem with the general practice extraction service is that it's what we call a collect once, use once system. And basically that means that every time there is a new requirement for GP data, that we have to do a significant amount of work, both internally and with the GP system suppliers and the practices in order to make that happen. That makes it incredibly expensive because it's 10 years old, it's using very old technology, and it needs replacing. The Audit Commission and a Public Health Public Accounts Committee have said that GPES should be replaced, and the replacement is GP data for planning and research, where we can more systematically collect that data, we can better protect it, and we can make that data available to more research planners. The other area in which this helps is that it reduces the burden on general practice, because at the moment, because we collect once and use once, then, and also that general practice data has been shared in other ways rather than through NHS Digital, that the GPs, who are called data controllers, and the data controllers of that data have to respond to every request. Whereas if we collect that data centrally, they'll no longer have to do that. So next slide, please, Jeff. So how will organisations access the data? So I've talked a little bit there about the collection of the data, but how will they access it? And the data, we are looking to hold the data in what's called a trusted research environment, or a TRE. And that would mean that we would still hold the data, but researchers and planners would be able to come and access that data or log into that data rather than us having to disseminate that data. And that gives it more protection, and we can manage that better. We are wanting to move to a position where all access to the data will be through a trusted research environment. And it may be that other organisations also have a trusted research environment. But basically that's our direction of travel. That will take us some time, but in the first instance, we will be able to service many of the research organisations in terms of them accessing the data rather than as disseminating the data. And we're also working with a chap called Ben Goldacre, who some of you may have heard of, in terms of looking at all those use cases and seeing how we can better allow access rather than disseminate. As I've said in the final bullet point, there are likely to be some exceptions to us being able to do that, but we will work with others to ensure that we move to a position where everybody accesses that via a very secure environment. Next one, please. I want to talk about opt-outs. Obviously, as an organisation, we want to respect Type 1 opt-outs. Type 1 opt-outs are there for patients in order to stop data leaving the general practice and moving to NHS Digital's processing. I actually introduced those around about 10 years ago as part of the general practice extraction service. And the reason why I did that is because there was no other opt-out available. Today, there is also a national data opt-out that's been introduced. And that means that we can, if a patient has a national data opt-out, we can collect that data, but we can't share it to organisations. So it is a bit confusing at the moment that there are two types of opt-out, but that's the reason why we've got into this place, which is historical. But any patient is able to use a type 1 or a national data opt-out. And as we've already said, those numbers are increasing at the moment. Next slide, please. What protections are in place? We take the protection of the data and safeguarding the data incredibly seriously at NHS Digitally, as we should. And prior to that data being sent to us, then the data is pseudonymized and encrypted before it's sent to NHS Digital. And in storage, it remains in that position. Thereby, simply looking at it, looking at that data, you cannot identify individuals. All applications for that data are scrutinized by a group of independent people, and there are some on this panel, who will look at each of those applications in terms of the legality to ensure that they are only for the purposes of planning and research, and they use a complete set of principles in order to go through every application to ensure that if they recommend it, it fulfills all those criteria. If it's successful, then there is a contract or a data sharing agreement with all those applicants that lists what they can do with the data, what they can't do with the data, and also the security they need to put around the data and the limitations to what they can do with that data. And that's a data sharing agreement between NHS Digital and every applicant. We also provide information via our NHS Digital website of all those successful applications in what we call our release register. And that's available. There are some concerns about the ability of people to understand that release register. We will be introducing a new release register, which will be much more accessible to patients and have far more detail, which will essentially track every successful applicant in terms of the data that they've got, who they are, and what security they've got in place. That should be in place by the beginning of next month. We also audit on a regular basis in terms of those successful applicants, and we make public those audit reports, and we have a number of sanctions that we can put in place if those applicants have not adhered to there. And finally, that we will never share or sell data for marketing or insurance purposes. This is purely for planning and research. Next slide, please, Jeff. Our plans for public communications. We're aware that we have played what I would call a relatively low-key public communications from now on. We have provided details to media outlets. We have provided a lot of information on our website, and we continue to do that. However, and we have also provided data to general practice. But we understand that general practice are under a lot of pressure at the moment, a huge amount of pressure, and we'll continue to do so. We're coming up to flu vaccination time, as well as the back end of the COVID vaccination period. And so general practice will continue to be a great deal of pressure. So what we want to do is to ourselves as NHS Digital do a lot more work in terms of communications. Things like this seminar, a lot more work in terms of how we do that. And we are about to launch a substantial campaign about this activity, which will publish that communication strategy, which will enable us to tell people about their choices throughout the summer. To finish, I'd just like to say that I think that the power of data is immense. I've shown you some examples of that. Patients absolutely have the legal right to opt out of us collecting this data. I'm just keen that we all work to making that an informed decision where people and members of the public like yourselves have got all the information they need in order to make that decision. Thanks, Jeff.
Dave, thank you for that introduction to the session. I think your summary remarks were actually quite good. I think that a lot of people I think most people out there want data to be used to save people's lives, but I think equally, as you said, that needs to be done in a way that brings people with us, the principles of no surprises. And we've seen that where we do talk to people, we do particularly involve them in these sort of discussions, it makes a huge difference. I just want to start by picking up on some of the questions that have been raised by the audience, and it did relate to the point about opt-out. So I mentioned opt-outs in my introduction, and I referred to the National Data Opt-out, which was previously called a Type 2 opt-out. So let me just paraphrase for people. A Type 1 opt-out means your data doesn't leave your GP practice other than for your care. A Type 2 opt-out means that the data can flow to NHS Digital, but it won't be moved onwards from NHS Digital in confidential format for research and planning. So that's why the two things fit together. And I think the point Phil was making was that if you want the data not to leave your GP, it's a Type 1 opt-out and not a Type 2, which is now called National Data Opt-out. In which case, I want to come to John Marsh first and say, John, as the patient panelist on here, do you find the Type 1, Type 2 National Data Opt-outs confusing or clear? And you've been in this area for a while.
I now understand it because people like you, Chris, have explained it to me on several occasions, and I've been involved in a couple of committees and things like that. So I do understand it, but it takes a bit of learning, and what it needs is clear explanations, and I don't think we've yet to the public those clear explanations of what data will flow out of your GP practice. And that's actually a question for Dave. I don't think he told us what data will leave our GP practice. And is there any data which will stay in the GP practice? So that's a question. But going back to the opt-out, I think we need to make it absolutely clear to the public that they have two choices. They can stop their whole data going out of their GP practice, which is Type 1, or they can let it go from their GP practice to NHS Digital. But then with Type 2 or the National Data Opt-out, it won't go outside NHS Digital or the NHS family, I suppose, to marketing and insurance companies or even university researchers or whatever. So there's a job to be done in explaining the two types of opt-out, explaining their effects, and how you implement. If you want to Type 1 or Type 2 opt-out, what you've got to do to make it happen.
And reflecting that, I'm going to ask the question that Pat Walsh has raised, which is the most popular one so far. Why hasn't NHS Digital made clear the differences between the two opt-outs? And why has NHS Digital made the Type 1 opt-out for the GP DPR simple and clear to opt out? So do NHS Digital think they've made it clear enough the difference in Type 1 and Type 2 opt-out?
So should I take that? So welcome everyone. I'm Arjun Dillon. My role, I'm Caldecott Guardian for NHS Digital, and in my role, I advise and lead on privacy issues in a leadership role. So I'm not operationally involved with the program, just so people understand the difference between myself and Dave's role in this conversation. So the question was around have NHS Digital done enough to explain the difference between the National Data Opt-out and Type 1? And I think what we are trying to explain is actually this is an area of transition. There have been lots of different data choices recorded historically, and Type 1 and Type 2 were only two of them. There's probably hundreds of different data choices recorded in electronic patient systems, ranging from local healthcare record sharing opt-outs or opt-in and opt-outs to national diabetes audits, osteoporosis audits. There's literally hundreds of these represented within the system. Type 1 and Type 2 opt-outs came about back in the GPES days, and actually came into sharp relief in the previous data programme where they were enacted. Essentially, this situation was recognised as a problem, and I believe Nicola is now filling large shoes, but Dame Fiona, in her second Caldecott review, reviewed the situation and was asked, please, can you give a suggestion on how consent. That culminated into the National Data Opt-out, which is meant to be put into place for April 2020. It was accepted by government and the policy was enacted. April 2020, for those of you who can remember that far back, was quite a tumultuous time, and the deadline was pushed back to September of this year. So the whole health service should be aligning to the National Data Opt-out by that point in time. My understanding is from once the National Data Opt-out is successfully implemented, other opt-outs will be reviewed in due course, and that's the situation. So that's the background. So in explanation, why is the Type 1 opt-out operationally so challenging, is because it was designed for the time that it was invented, where the only time you record Type 1s was within the GP system, and so it was done to GPs like myself to record it in the system. You wouldn't necessarily design it that way if you were to design it now. Unfortunately, the spirit of the Type 1 opt-out is that no data will leave outside the GP practice, creates challenges if we're asked to, if outside agencies are then asked to handle them. So when there have been exceptions to the rule to say count how many Type 1 opt-outs, we have been specifically, we, NHS Digital, have been specifically instructed not to identify those people, do anything with it other than count them. And so there are quite strict and appropriate limitations on what we are able to do. That does not mean that we would not consider trying to find ways to make that better and more understandable. And I'm sure the National Data Guardian will be listening very intensely to the needs of patients to ensure that any review of opt-outs going forward, all these views are represented, not wanting to talk on her behalf.
Did you want to comment on that, Nicola?
I think that's certainly right. I will be making sure I'm very involved in those discussions, and I think it's very important that both the public and professionals are consulted about them. I think for me that it is a very complex area, and I think, as Arjun said, nobody would take a blank piece of paper and design the opt-out scheme we have at the moment. It was a response to fixing problems, as many things in the NHS health and care are, to fixing the problems that were there at the time. So it is confusing, and that's been a very loud and clear message that's, I think, been evident in feedback over the last few weeks. It's not clear at all what they mean. I thought it was interesting when Dave showed that visual about the application of the opt-outs. I found that quite helpful, and I am quite a visual person, and I would be keen in the coming months that we really think about, and the system thinks about, not only providing very clear explanations of things, but I think also visualizing them can be very helpful. One thing I think that can be quite confusing about the Type 1 opt-out is that I think people might have the impression that data doesn't leave their GP, full stop, that their personal records, their confidential information will essentially be staying on the hard drive of their GP's computer in the surgery, when that's already not the case. The data leaves your GP surgery. It goes to the electronic record system, so a commercial provider that manages that, whether that's in a physical server somewhere else or in the cloud. That provider is very closely monitored by NHS Digital in terms of quality and assurance, as you'd expect it to be. But we already aren't in a system that's analogous to having a paper folder that we're also familiar with, well, most of us old enough are familiar with from the past. And I think, so the Type 1's actively unhelpful, I think, almost sort of implying that if you're not clear about that yourself. So I think there's a lot, like Arjun said, I think there's a lot of work to be done here to make that clearer to people.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Oh, and we'll come back to that in a second. Phil, and I'll go to Phil first, and then Jeff, you wanted to come in. Phil. Oh, you're on mute, Phil, still.
So while we are talking about opt-out, let me be very clear. We understand, Med Confidential understands that there are many opt-outs. What we are talking about here, though, specifically, is opt-outs for what used to be called secondary uses and what Chris correctly termed purposes beyond someone's direct care. Okay, so we can focus down and ignore all of the rest of those. Yeah? There are not that many of those. We believe there will need to be at least 2 opt-outs within the NHS for patients. There will need to be the one which is currently best represented, I guess, by the summary care record opt-out, which is if you really don't want your personal data, your medical information to be shared with anyone other than your immediate care team. Now, that obviously could have quite significant consequences for people if they're trying to be, if they need to be looked after in other care contexts. So that is a discrete thing. But the national data opt-out, of which we are in principle entirely supportive, is and should be a singular statement by a patient that they do not wish their data to be used for purposes beyond their direct care by anybody. Yeah, that clearly, in understanding the systems of the NHS, is something that needs to be visible on the NHS spine, something which every NHS and health body can see and has to, because they're on computer systems that must relate to those centralized systems. So clearly the place for that ultimately is there. But until that national data opt-out captures and enacts not just the function, but the spirit, as Arjun said, of the type 1 opt-out, it is not functioning properly. If the national data opt-out seen by a GP practice does not stop the GP practice from flowing data to NHS Digital, then you will have not replaced what the patient expects to happen. And no amount of fudging is going to change that. Patients should never have to know or understand the systems of the NHS and how they work in order to be able to trust and have confidence that their rights and their wishes are being respected. And it is the job of the NHS and its system builders and systems designers to manifest that. As Nicola said, we're in a situation where people have phones. There is a cloud, or there are many clouds, and data is processed all over the place. But I don't think most people are that naive to think that everything is held in a Lloyd George envelope or on the desktop PC of their own GP. The critical thing is that the GP is the data controller of their patient's data. And this is why we're in the situation that we are in. Directed by the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, NHS Digital has been told to create a new system, the GP Data for Planning and Research system. And thus directed by Matt Hancock, it has powers under the Health and Social Care Act to go and require GPs who are data controllers of their patients' records to allow NHS Digital to take a copy. Okay? Forget any naive notion of where bits of data may be sitting on hard drives. That is the legal and actual situation, and that is what we need to address with any and every opt-out scenario.
Phil, thank you for summarizing that up. I'm going to go to Jeff and then Arjun. They've got their hands up. Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, perhaps I can just extend slightly on what Phil said and come back to one of the core differences between the national data opt-out and the type 1. So one of the key things, if you look on the national data opt-out stuff on the NHS website, it says you can stop your confidential patient information being used for research and planning. I think that's sort of what people hope that means. But when you look at the policy behind it, there are a number of exclusions from that, which are necessary, which are appropriate. So some of those exclusions are things like court orders, for example. You can't opt out of a court requiring you to provide your data if the court requires it. But one of the issues is that because the way in which that policy is worded is that if there's a legal requirement, and as Phil said, the powers of the Health and Social Care Act allow the Secretary of State to put that legal requirement onto GPs. That is why the national data opt-out doesn't apply to the data being taken from the controllership of your GP to the controllership of NHS Digital. And I think Phil makes the very important point that what matters isn't really where the data sits, it's who's controlling what's done with it. And that's when the data actually moves. So I think it's really key to understand, and if you go on the NHS Digital website, you can look at all the other Secretary of State directions for the uses of data to which your national data opt-out won't apply. There are quite a lot of them. Most of them, many of us would consider reasonable. The question is whether whether people should be able to opt out of some of these things, or whether it's reasonable to say, actually, there are limits to what you can opt out of, and this is one of them. And that's where I step back, because I don't feel that I can make that judgment. But I think it's an important difference. In fact, the type 1 opt-out originally, when the whole care.data thing kicked off, the type 1 opt-out, because that was a direction as well, type 1 opt-outs weren't going to apply to it until the then Secretary of State stood up and said they were going to apply to it, which caused a little bit of kerfuffle, I think, in those trying to design the systems to make it work. So it's a policy. It's not law that the national data opt-out doesn't apply. It's not law that the national data opt-out cannot apply to something that's a legal requirement. In fact, there have been, under COPI regulations, which are another legal requirement, there have been some situations where the national data opt-out has been applied. So it would be possible, in fact, for the Secretary of State to say, in this case, we are going to apply the national data opt-out to the collection of the GP data for planning and research, if the Secretary of State were so minded. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And I want to let Arjun comment because he's a hand up, and then I want to ask a question which I might ask Mark to comment on from a slightly different perspective. So Arjun, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so really, Jeff has made the point that I was wanting to make, but really just to frame it, the type 1 opt-out and the national data opt-out exist beyond the scope of this program. Existing data flows for GP data already flow and already should be being respected and needs to do this. The whole point of this program is to allow a single place where concerned colleagues and members of the public can see all of those data flows in one place, as opposed to having to do that in 6,500 places. That really was the intent. Equally, there is a really important point that I want to link back to John's point earlier of we're talking about this ethereal concept of data, okay? What really, it's a personal view, I can't say it's a corporate view, but I really do think patients should start being able to see their own data, and so they actually know what it is we're talking about. So one is records in the widest sense. So what is it my GP actually writes after I see him, and did it have anything to do with the conversation? You know, I do have those conversations with my patients, and there's a lot of learning from those conversations. But there's an element of what is this program actually collecting, and to be clear, it is only the coded data. Or it's a technical phrase. There are clinical terminologies that are read by computers, and it is the coded elements of the data that are being taken, and there is a time limit on some of those elements. It is not taking the free text. It is not taking your letters and other attachments. If you've had a video consultation or you've sent a photo in of a rash, we are not, that is not within scope or intended to be in scope of this program. Just to be clear, I think John asked that earlier, and I just wanted to answer that. But I think all of this, and I've made recommendations, and it requires a system-wide approach. It's not within just NHS Digital's gift to do this, but my very strong belief is that patients should be able to see the data that we collect, and actually should be able to see where that data is used, and ideally even see the benefits that is drawn. That would be the panacea. We are not there yet, and if we don't get past step 1, we will not be able to get there, but that would be my hope for us and our program moving forward.
Thank you, Arjun. And just for those listening live or listening later, the point about the benefits of patients being able to access and see their own data and their own records was made in a previous webinar, which is available on the Use My Data website as well. That's well worth a look, particularly in terms of, okay, what happens next? I just want to summarize based on what I think I've heard, and particularly following some of the chat that people have said. This is clearly a complex issue, even just this one question. And at least one person has said, it's far too complex for the average person to understand. I think it is complicated, but it needs to be made simple. This seems to me a significant communication exercise. I'm seeing whether people are nodding or shaking their head. Given that this needs a significant amount of effort to put into clear, concise communication for the wider members of patients and members of the public, do we think that can all be done robustly by the start of September? And if that's, in terms of putting those things together, is it possible to involve patients in what can be quite complex conversations? And the reason I've said that is, Mark, you've done work in this country and across Europe in involving patients in quite complex conversations, which are not this conversation, but you've got some experience in the benefits of being able to do that. Did you want to reflect on that particularly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks, Chris, and some wonderful questions and comments in the chat, a lot of which I very much agree with. We started in 2012, 2013, looking at the issue of cancer inequalities. It's an area that I'm really passionate about. And what we decided to do was first to categorize what were the cancer inequalities, not just in the UK, but right across Europe. And then once we'd done that, we said, well, what are we going to do about it? Because it's all very well having the information, but what are we going to use that information for? So we had a series of meetings with health professionals, with cancer patients, with members of the public to try and identify what were the key issues, and also how could we use that data as intelligence to change things. I remember very clearly as part of that, some people felt, oh, we've had enough conversation now, it's time to go on and actually implement. I wasn't one of those people, because I think you have to really listen and go down into depth into conversations. And as Chris says, some of the issues that we have here today, some of the issues that we talked about were not simple yes, no answers. There were gradations, and it really needed us to think about it. And so one of the things we did was we actually said, let's get the health professionals out of the room for a minute. And actually, let's have a forum that's just with patients, their carers, and members of the public. So we hosted that forum, as it turned out, in Dublin, which is where I'm from originally. And it was so instructive. And the other thing we said to ourselves, the sort of people who were doing it, was we will actually listen and not talk. We will facilitate the actual discussion, but as much as possible, we want to collect opinions. And that's why I think it's brilliant today. This session is mostly about listening to people and not about giving loads of presentations and commentary, etc., like that. And what we found that came out of that was a far better result than would have come out of the previous meetings we had. And we ended up developing a European Cancer Patient Bill of Rights. It reflected the views of patients. It was co-created by patients and health professionals. We launched it in the European Parliament on World Cancer Day. It won the 2018 European Health Award, and it's now being used in policy right across Europe. But if we hadn't have waited and actually had a deeper conversation, I don't think we would have produced something, one, as good, but two, as impactful as we did. So I think it's absolutely critical that we involve patients and members of the public in this conversation. And trying to do something in a rushed fashion is not the way to do that. It's actually the listening that's really important, the learning. I've seen some comments in relation to patients having access to their data and being able to see their data. The other thing is they can actually improve that data by actually giving their insight as well. So I think there's still, there's a big communication piece to be done, but there's also a big listening piece to be done. So communication is not just about talking and presenting, it's also about listening. And I would like to hope that, certainly our experience could be used. Obviously, it wasn't specifically in a data space, although we'd use cancer intelligence to inform the debate, but I think it's really important that we use that to help us to go on this journey together. because I think we want to go on this journey together. I think we all see what the potential benefits are, but we need to balance those against the actual realities that we see before us today. And the other thing is, as you said at the very start about, sort of using acronyms and that, I've counted so far that there's been 25 acronyms used in the conversation. There's people in the chat saying, I'm trying to write things down. I don't know what X, Y, and Z is. So, if there's anything we should recommend, cut the acronyms.
Thank you, Mark. Part of communication. John, before I move the topic slightly, and we'll pick this up towards the end when we're summarising the things that need to happen, from a patient perspective, do you think we can clarify and provide information on what GPDPR is and intends to do by September? Because I feel this is a significantly larger conversation that needs to be had. What are your thoughts?
Well, I always like to set ambitious targets, as you possibly know, Chris. I'd like to have a good go at it, but let's start by improving the quality of the information that's provided to patients, and see how we get on. But if we say now that it's going to be December, then it'll be March. Let's set ambitious targets and get on with it, because let's face it, better health data is going to lead to better health research and therefore better health. And the sooner we do that, more lives will be saved. So I don't want us to meekly accept long delays.
Okay, thank you, John. I want to hold that there, and we're going to come back to this in terms of summary later, but I want to pick up on some of the things that have been put in the Q&A, some things around the uses of data. And there are lots of questions about where data is used, how do we find out where it's used, and is that clear enough? Dave mentioned right at the start of this that for NHS Digital, they publish a release of data, so that the data request that they've submitted, they've satisfied and sent data out to people is on the web, and you can go through that in a lot of detail that shows you who's had access to that. A question for either Dave or Arjun. You mentioned, I think, that was going to be made more accessible, and in terms of communicating to people how their data has been used, even now, is that part of the wider communications campaign, or is that something that's coming on down the line fairly quickly?
Sure. I mean, the data release register we've always had. We have a number of colleagues on the phone who read that in extreme detail, and I'm very grateful for that attention, including reading the minutes from iGuard. So I do welcome the emails and reminders of, did you actually catch that, or did you get that right? And actually, quite frankly, we do need we need people to keep an eye on that stuff. The reason we put it out there is so that people look at it and read it. In terms of the enhancements, accessible means something very particular. What we're talking about is we're putting a set of tooling on top of the data that we have, and we're enriching the data that's there. So for those of you that are technically orientated, we're using a technology called Power BI, which happens to be a Microsoft product, to put on top of our data release register, and it will be it's been uplifted. That project was not part of GP Data for Planning and Research. That was an ongoing series of improvements that we've been trying to improve on to improve our ongoing transparency, and it's just one example. In terms of the use, I mean, without making it too simple, this is about planning and research. There have been exceptional circumstances in the recent history where we have been compelled to use data originally intended for secondary uses for treating patients, but that's mainly been driven by the pandemic and wouldn't normally be something we need to do, and we'd have to be absolutely explicit about that. Planning, what do we mean by planning? Planning is CCGs, NHS England, regional teams making plans for their services for their population as currently. Moving forward, the NHS is likely to reform around ICSs, and I would expect ICSs to continue that function and needing to use that data to work out. That we're not a completely homogenous bunch across England. There are different needs in different areas. Those of you who are interested, there are things called joint strategic needs assessments, etc., which all drive the planning cycles that work there. And equally, CCGs need to know what's going on within their data in order to ensure that they're meeting their objectives and ensuring quality of services. So that's the planning piece. Research is a broad church, so we need to be clear about that. There are things on one end of the spectrum. You have, say, a consented regulated clinical trial, which is a framework that most of us would be there. That would be an example, and I'm sure colleagues on the call will come into this, but that would be an example where consent might override an opt-out. But if we don't have the data, we're not able to do so. And so that would be a challenge. But there are some excellent trials. We've mentioned the big recovery, but I don't want people to forget normal straightforward research, which is the stuff that keeps health and care going. And then there is the data science part of research, but all of them, if they wish to apply to NHS Digital for data, have to demonstrate a health and care benefit. Now, the way that we exercise that and evaluate that is through both our DARS team, who are our employees who check the applications, and we have set out our scorecard, our scoring system on our website, and they check it against that. And we have the independent group advising on the release of data, iGuard, who check that. The additional element we've put for this program is we've brought in representatives from the profession. What I mean by that is the BMA and the RCGP, who also look at the requests for GP data in particular with a professional view and the concerns at the professional rate. So we've added that additional set of governance. I think that is pretty comprehensive. I can't tell you it's 100% perfect. No human system is. But certainly, I'm not aware of anyone else who has this degree of rigor around ensuring benefit from the use of data and compliance with a published rule set. And so that, I think, is the tangible step change that we can offer to people using GP data. It also means that we're not forcing people to go direct to GPs for data. Currently, people are going there because there is a need. The data is already flowing from general practice. And by having this conversation, by bringing this up, we're able to explain this, the safeguards that we have in place, and hopefully assure people, or at least let people make their own minds up. My opinion is you're asking about whether those uses are this sort of idea about commercial companies, etc. There are commercial companies who have CCG customers where they are delivering insights and additional visualizations, and they're all published and available on our website. We have made that commitment, and we're not backing off from that. And that's
so Arjun, in terms of that came from the data release register. So what you're saying is that NHS Digital have got some robust processes to check who wants access to data and why, and what they do with it. The data release register, who you've sent data out to, is published on the website, and we'll put a link to that in the summary of this afterwards. And that also includes what they intend to do with it, what the legal basis is that's been provided to them with as well. We can flag that. Phil, I've got you. I can see you wanting to come in on that point with your hand up, because this was something that a couple of people have asked around. Do we flag the differences between data for public health planning or selling data to companies, in inverted commas? Should the types of data release be categorized? I think they are in the data release register. And who do we mean by third parties, which again might be the data release register? So some of those points might be picked up. But Phil, you've got your hand up politely.
Thank you. And I want to emphasize before I speak that everything that Arjun has just said is true. Okay, it's what has not been said. Arjun, Dave, and others at NHS Digital in the invidious position of having to defend the indefensible and a system that has been going wrong for years. So while it is true that some of the customers, people who receive copies of patients' data, even in many cases, copies of patients who have exercised a national data opt-out, some of those organizations which receive data are what are termed information intermediaries. Yeah, they can sublicense the use of that data to people, which, as Arjun said, includes NHS bodies like CCGs and whatever else. But because the language around the policy is not solely for commercial purposes, that means if they are serving a CCG, they are free to also service commercial partners. And that is how companies which show up in the register and also on our representation of it, which I posted the link to theysolditanyway.com in the comments, they show, you know, companies which get this data and service clients who on their websites openly say, we provide pharmaceutical companies, data and device companies with market insights, with market access. Yeah. So, you know, it's fine and good, and no one is disputing. No one is disputing the positive benefits of planning and research. But the poison in the barrel of all of this, the thing that people care about, and we know people care about, is or are these commercial uses, which again, you know, I'm afraid on this one, they don't appear in the data release registers. Yeah, it may be, we've looked at the contracts, it may be that NHS Digital has a list of every end customer for these information intermediaries, but those every end customer does not appear in the data release register. So while you're publishing something, and I repeat, NHS Digital has done far more, certainly since the Partridge Review revealed the past practices of its precursor body. It has done far more in this space. Yeah. But it is still insufficient to be saying to the public, well, here we go, here is a list of what is done if there is stuff missing. And if it is not made clear that in quite a number of instances, you know, we checked the last month's releases, about 80% of the time, the national data opt-out was essentially not respected. That undermines any other promises that are made and makes it very hard to maintain the sort of trust that is required. And we're not naive. We understand that, you know, research and the NHS itself are complex ecosystems. Yeah, there are going to be commercial companies involved. Yeah, but making bold claims like, well, we don't sell it to marketers or insurers, you know, is really quite condescending when you cannot provide the evidence and when someone who does look at it sees, as I say, commercial entities getting, you know, market insights, market access, you know, for money.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I actually want to ask Nicola, because she's got a hand up to respond, and I really want to get through some of the questions from the delegates as well. So Nicola, if you've got a response on that one.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, because I think Phil's absolutely right. I mean, I'm very aware that people's concerns about commercial interests have been prominent in the last few weeks, and those are very legitimate concerns. And I thought it might be helpful to flag some work we've done in the NDG office. I use the royal we. Much of it was done, obviously, by my predecessor, Dame Fiona Caldicott. But we've done work in the last year on putting good into practice is the name of the report that's on our website, but on assessment of public benefits. And we did some very extensive engagement with the public through a public deliberation methodology, which is all outlined in the report. But I suppose the key finding, which I think is so relevant to much of what's being discussed here, is about the prerequisites of transparency for any public benefit, that it's indivisible from public benefit. And I think so much of what we're talking about is how do we improve transparency of the system? How can people be clear about what's happening to their data, what the safeguards are, who makes decisions, what the independent oversight is? And I think I'm very welcoming of the news about the data release register, for example, because at the moment I find that difficult to navigate. And I think work being done to make that absolutely usable for all of us in the public to be able to go on and see, I think is really helpful. Because a second part of our findings from the public benefit work was about the importance of transparency through the whole data life cycle. So this isn't just about what happens at the point of assessment. I think people should be able to see how data is used throughout its life cycle and what the outcomes of that data use are, whether that's system planning, research, you know, so it's not just who gets to see the data and who made the decision. I think people need to see that life cycle, and that be very transparent as well. And a third prerequisite, I should say, apart from transparency and the importance of the life cycle, was about the authentic public engagement. And that is absolutely crucial. And coming back to the question about, devising comms, I think the work of the next few months, the system mustn't just be on transmit. It's got to be on the method of engagement, and including patients and the public in what makes sense to people. So we can't just assume that we know how to make things clear to people. We've got to test that out. We've got to get feedback and understand what actually makes sense, what works in terms of explanations. But it is worth noting that in terms of this commercial issue, which obviously was comprehensively addressed in this public assessment, public benefit work that we've done, and we are producing guidance on the back of that report that will be coming out in the coming months, that through that deliberative process, we found that the public aren't necessarily against commercial interests. And I think people, once you engage with information, can take kind of mature attitude towards that. But what people are really concerned about is that the commercial interest never outweighs the public benefit. So that all times the benefit to patients, the public, and the NHS and the healthcare system are absolutely front and centre and trump any commercial interest. So that's not to say commercial interest can't be there or shouldn't be there, because in terms of innovation and improvements, etc., obviously they can be key partners, whether that's pharmaceutical developments or whatever kind of system development you're talking about. But at all times, public benefits must come first. And I thought that was a very important piece of work, and I'm hoping our guidance, I'm looking forward to being involved in disseminating that guidance, because I think it could be very useful for the system as a whole.
Thanks, Nicola. And that actually picks up on a point Emily Rimmer had asked, which is one of the top questions around what are the benefits of giving data to people. So if we're producing something which describes how to evaluate those benefits, and if the data release register is being revamped to make it clearer for people, and I would, by the way, strongly encourage you involve patients in that redesign if that's not already happened, patients, members of the public and others, then that would go some way to demonstrating where data's gone to, what the benefits were anticipated to be, and indeed whether those benefits were accrued and seen back by the NHS at the end of the day. I think that's an important point. One specific point which was asked was around penalties. So if people give access to data from NHS Digital, are there any penalties if they break the agreement of that data sharing? Is that something you could quickly answer, Arjun?
In terms of audit, so the audits will look at all elements within the data sharing agreement. So this idea that we give data away and it's not controlled is not completely true. We do give extracts. It's under a framework contract and a data sharing agreement. So there are controls of which the right to audit is embedded. When we do the audits, we publish them, and generally there's like with all audits, there's a rectification plan in order to come into line. Ultimately, our ultimate sanction, so it depends on the nature of the breach. So if there is a breach which actually breaks the controls so that it fundamentally constitutes a crime, it will become a crime, in which case that's a different issue. To my knowledge, that hasn't happened. There have been security concerns and all the normal things when auditors go round, and they've been rag rated and rectification plans have been put in, and not always as fast as we would like to come into there. Ultimately, the ultimate sanction outside of a criminal offence having been committed is a data destruction notice being served. So remember, if there is not an active contract, they cannot hold the data and they must delete it. That is the framework. Okay. And so we can serve a data destruction notice, and they must certify that they've destroyed the data that they hold.
And so I'm aware that NHS Digital do audits, not on every data release, but on some. And some of those are flagged up areas where agreements have been not strictly adhered to in some areas, and the agreements are published. In fact, we'll put a link on the summary of this to show that people what sort of breaches of the agreement have taken place and what the summary has been. I think I just want to move that question slightly onwards. There is always a risk, and we've seen this at the previous webinar we had for Use My Data about trusted research environments. There is always a risk of an organization such as NHS Digital sending out a big copy of data to another organization, because it's essentially called fire and forget. It's very difficult to track what happens with that. It's a point that Phil's made. There is another opportunity here, surely, that if we're going to bring more data inside NHS Digital, should it be managed securely within a trusted research environment. This is an area where data can be held, where you don't give data out, but you allow people to come into and use that domain to do their research inside that environment. They can be watched, they can be checked, the limitations on what they can see can be applied. Do we think this will be a significant step in increasing public trust around current data and indeed around new sets of GP data that could be brought in? Maybe I'll ask John from a patient perspective on that one.
Thanks. Well, I do think trusted research environments would be good because it does give that control that people are not taking data out of the NHS, they're taking the results of analysis out of the NHS. Those results can then be used for research, medical research, planning, whatever. But there is the control that no individual patient's data goes out. Obviously, none of the data in there would be identifiable anyway, but, you know, people can put 2 and 2 together sometime, maybe. But trusted research environments make certain that no patient data goes out. So I think it's a positive way forward and allows NHS Digital to exercise the controls that we demand of it in terms of not allowing data to be misused. It's one lever that they can use to prevent that happening.
Okay, so which picks up on 2 of the questions Sean Key has asked separately around the roles of trusted research environment. One question is within that is, will trusted research environments only be available, sorry, are they the only way by which organizations or people or academics can get to the data, or will data still be sent out to, his concern was commercial organizations in future? Will trusted research environments solve all this or not?
Should I answer that? And just to flag, Chair, Mark has been patiently keeping his hand up and signalling over a number of questions. So
thank you. Sorry, Mark. I'll come to you next.
No problem.
Should I do that very quickly, Mark? Apologies, but
yeah, far away.
Hopefully, I've done you a service. TREs as a direction of travel is something that NHS Digital want to support and move forward. There is, what we don't want to end up is that everyone has a TRE. Clearly, that's not a tenable situation, and of course, our TRE is better than everyone else's. I mean, we've got to kind of get to the right position on that. But our approach coming into this program was that it should be TRE by default. We are clearly looking at hardening that line moving forwards. But just to highlight, TREs give a lot of fantastic assurances, but introduce some other issues for us, which we will work through. But essentially, there will always be use cases where data will need to flow in some circumstances. The easiest one to give an example is consented trials, where the patients themselves have asked for the data to go for a particular purpose to a particular. I mean, that would be the easiest example to do so. There are some fantastic work being done by, I don't know, Biobank is a very prominent trial that is ongoing with significant work ongoing on consent. Genomics England have done lots of similar work. There are things for planning where the data may need to flow to colleagues. So NHS bodies particularly need the actual data and to get their hands on it. So those would be notable exceptions, but being really clear about those exceptions and mapping all possible exceptions is probably critical to moving this forward. I think I've answered the question. Hopefully, Chris, we can bring Mark in.
Okay, thank you, Arjun. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Chris. 3 years ago, we brought together patients, HCR UK, and also so the Health Data Research UK, and then also we worked with the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which is an organization that looks specifically at genomic data. And again, we highlighted that this was a really important part of what we needed to do, this idea of trusted research environments, and the really satisfying the idea that you have safe people, so people who are trained, working on safe projects because you're within the trusted research environment, utilizing safe data in safe places and giving safe outputs. So we're very supportive of this approach going forward, but it has to involve patients in that discussion in relation to how we best do it. So that, and going back to Nicola's point, one of the things we very much highlight within DataCan, which is the UK's Health Data Research Hub for Cancer, is fair value. So whatever we do in relation to the use of data, that needs to have fair value. That fair value needs to be for the patients, it needs to be for the NHS, it needs to be for researchers, and it needs to be to look to see where are there issues where there are, we do need to have commercial involvement, but they need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. We're very lucky within DataCan that we have a very strong PPIE group, so public and patient involvement group, who actually look at all the proposals that we have from a research perspective. And if our patients say, no, we don't agree with that proposal, then we don't do it. So I do think we have to involve patients more in this conversation. The other thing is, in the UK, we have incredibly talented patient public engagement people who know what data actually is, who can contribute to this conversation. So it would be very stupid if we go ahead without actually involving people who actually know a lot about this area. So I think it's really important that we bring together that community, and that community working together can really achieve a lot, and achieve a lot of what we want to do in relation to what's on discussion today in relation to the use of GP data for planning and research. But it's bringing everybody along on that journey together is critically important.
Thank you, Mark. Now, just slightly more widely, I've just been scanning through the questions and some of the stuff that's come up in the chat as well. There are lots of talk about the term NHS data grab, which seems to be in the media. It seems to be quite a nice thing to write, easy to say. 3 words as well, always popular. How do we get confidence back from this point to address that thing about this being a really bad NHS data grab? I may ask Nicola first, but I want to come to Phil because I know this is something which we were talking about recently as well. Nicola, did you want to think about how do we get the confidence back here?
I think the use of language is very important, and what we call things and what we invoke by the words we use is matters. So for me, I'm very uncomfortable with the word grab. Grabbing data, using my data in certain contexts, depending on the sentence, but certainly grabbing always, and scraping data as well. I mean, I don't want, those concepts are so close to the idea of exploitation, the word, and I think that's unhelpful. But I think if we speak in terms of, do I want my data to be grabbed? I don't want anything of mine to be grabbed, thank you very much. But if you ask me, do I want my experience to count, my health and illness experience to count, for my experience to be represented, for example, to commissioners? I was thinking a lot about the question of air quality, for example, in relation to physical and mental health, and what we know increasingly about how important that is. So I don't have asthma, but if I had asthma and had a child with asthma, I would want that experience to be represented and counted in data that was known about at a local system level, in terms of what are we doing in terms of our air pollution, and are we taking that seriously? So I think the language we use really does matter, and I think it's important for both sides, if you like, because I think it can become very unhelpful when people simply talk about removing barriers, or IG being a barrier, or let's just break things down. I think that's equally unhelpful, because IG is there to protect our rights. Privacy matters, confidentiality matters. And I think equally you can get into a very unhelpful, slippy language that implies these are all just things to sort of brush aside. And so I think both of those sort of polarized opposites approaches to language are unhelpful. I'm not saying it's easy to do, and I'm not saying I always achieve it myself, but the more we can try and communicate in ways that use neutral language in terms that are just factual, rather than trying to manipulate or steer people into one position or another, I think the better.
So I think what I'm hearing is that we need to grasp the agenda to communicate this much more clearly that people can make a choice about, rather than it being seen, it's either this or it's this. And I think maybe from my perspective, the way to do that is to involve the different people with different perspectives, different views, different backgrounds in producing that, rather than expecting one person or one body to do that on our behalf. Phil, I just wanted to bring you in. There's been some things recently that Use My Data put out their position statement on this, which includes what we'd like to see happening. Understanding Patient Data, the Wellcome Trust have done similar things, as have others. What would be your reflection on sort of what we heard now, but particularly what we need to do from here to make things work? Because I think I'll be correct in thinking you actually want to see the benefits of data used for research to save people's lives. So what collectively do you think we ought to do in terms of the next steps on this?
Okay, so I'll get to sequencing, and I agree. I think Use My Data and MedConfidential for years have been aligned in our basic interests. We have always said, MedConfidential has always said, we want every use of patients' data to be consensual, safe, and transparent. And we further say that we see no conflict between good research, good ethics, and good medical care. But in order to get those things, you have to do it right. On the very specific point about language, though, the specific language that I used, and I know because I used it, is I called this Matt Hancock's sneaky GP data grab. And the alliteration or the bounce in that was deliberate. MedConfidential is a tiny 2-person NGO trying to prevent what looks like a grab to me. It may, they're all good purposes, but Matt Hancock directed NHS Digital to do something and gave them 6 weeks to do it in the middle of a pandemic while the GPs were busy. And we've seen the consequences of it. So, if we're going to talk about the good, then we actually need to accept that what has happened was not good and was fairly described. And I think most people would agree with my description rather than everything else. And you'll notice that I'm actually focusing on the people who are pushing this, not attacking NHS Digital, who we have continued to work with since they made us aware of this programme in late March. Okay, so from our perspective, the sequence, because of what has happened, has to be, the thing has to be made safe. We've talked about the trusted research environment. That has to be true. And in order for it to be true, it has to be directed to be true. Matt Hancock has to say and send down the statutory order to NHS Digital that the GP data and anything linked to it will only be processed in the safe setting. That's going to require quite a bit of work, certainly with the stuff that the CCGs and DUSCROs, sorry, I'm using acronyms, but bits NHS bodies use, as well as some of the other things. It's going to shut down some companies' business models, possibly. Okay, so there's quite a lot of work to do. You're not going to do that in 2 months by September. That's just cuckoo land. But it has to start with making it safe, because the next step is communicating it. And first, you need to communicate it to GPs themselves, the ones who are currently the data controllers, the ones who are going to have to manage, some of these interactions as the programme rolls forward. And as we have seen, by announcing to GPs and the public at the same time on the 12th of May, we've got the catastrophic situation of GPs turning down people's opt-outs or direct them to do it online when that's not the actual opt-out the person is trying to do. Once, therefore, it's safe and what you communicate to GPs is true and they understand what's going on, you can then move to communicating to the public. And at that point, you have to be able to clearly explain what's going on. And I absolutely agree with Nicola. It needs to be visual. It needs to be in multiple languages. But most importantly, every patient needs to be written to. Unless the government and NHS make that step, which we've been saying was necessary since before care.data, they cannot claim that they have made best effort. They'll say, oh, well, we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, because we sent that junk mail leaflet and it didn't work. A junk mail leaflet is not an addressed letter to a patient. And we've been sending millions, if not tens of millions of such letters during the pandemic to people about things that are in the headlines all the time. So don't give me we're digital, so we can't do that. Sending a paper letter will reach those people who are least likely to be reached by activity on social media and YouTube videos and whatever the hell else has been done. Make that best effort, and with that letter include the forms which are required for people to express their choice, which they have a right to. Now, both NHS Digital and ourselves have been, offering and sending paper forms to people who don't have printers. It's kept my colleague Sam completely tied up for almost a week and a half. Okay, that was a catastrophic error of judgment, thinking that oh well, we can put some stuff on a website and then we'll just be able to print it off and do whatever they need with it. Yeah. So this needs to be thinking about involving patients, as everyone I think has said here, of course, and involving patients of different communities and different sort of ages and all the different things, so that we get a communication that can be as clear as possible to everyone, and then, and only then, send the DPN, the data provision notice, to start the process towards extraction. Once you've got it safe, you communicate and explain to GPs, you can communicate, explain, and get the consent or dissent of patients themselves, only then can you start to flow this. And I think reasonably, 2 months is ridiculous. When care.data was paused in 2014, in February 2014, the first pause was at least 6 months. And we had a body, the Care Data Advisory Group, of which Med Confidential was a member, where we continued the work to try to actually make the communication work and make what was being communicated true. If we deviate in any way from those steps or sequences, I fear we'll just blow things up again.
Phil, thank you for that. And that's good, Tammy. I realise you got your hand up, Jeff, but I am going to have to tie some of this up because we've got about 3 minutes left on this. And I do want to ask the audience a couple of other questions as well. We said at the start of this was meant to bring some of your questions in and hopefully provide some of the answers. What I want to ask by putting a poll up is, has that changed? Given what you've heard today, has your understanding of what the GPDPR is changed or not? How's your level of understanding now? This is not level of comfort, this is a level of understanding. I'll just leave that running for a second more. Okay, I'm going to bring that to a close. I hope, not got my stato hat, I would hope that demonstrates that what you've heard from the panelists today and their contributions has indeed been helpful. Whether it's allayed the concerns you have is a different question. And a final question I would therefore like to ask is, oops, which I've just given the wrong question to. No, I've lost that question. I'll come back to that. I think just to summarize, and you can forgive my words if you want. What I've heard today, it seems to me, is that there is everybody's pushing to get the right thing done. Everybody heard from the panelists and virtually all the comments we've had, Q&A and comments, being, we know that data can be used to save lives, and I think people generally are very keen to do that. What we have also seen is a general level of lack of comfort, of uncertainty, and lack of clarity about how this is going to happen. And equally, that this is soluble. What we didn't come up with in the panelists and even with the Q&A was we don't know what to do with this. This seems to be an eminently soluble problem, and I think we've had some suggestions towards the end of the chat about steps that we might take to actually do that. Making things safe. We've talked about trusted research environments, much more transparency, communicating the GPs as the key people around this to make sure they're comfortable, they're on board. So when I talk to my GP, they're comfortable with these things. Communicating with the public, letting everybody know what's going on in ways which they can understand, they can engage with, to allow them to make an appropriate choice. And then fundamentally acting on that choice, respecting what it is they've chosen to do, which comes down to the choice you're communicating to them. I think what we've seen is that, for me, there is a way through this, but it is going to require a collective effort from everybody here and everybody beyond as well. This is not something which a single person, a single organization could solve, but I think it is soluble. Nobody here has said, let's not do this. They said, let's do this properly. And I'm hoping that's what I've heard. So given the hour now at time, I'd just like to thank all of you for your time and contributions today, whether as a delegate, raising Q&A, as a very patient panelist. I'm sorry it's taken a while to get round to all of you. I hope being able to answer collectively some of these questions and raise some of the concerns. As I said at the start of the webinar, the recording will be available on the Use My Data site, as well as highlights of the key points. We will also publish every question we were asked, even if we didn't answer them, and every Q&A and comment that was posted as well. So those will be available in full, and we'll do that fairly quickly. So finally, I'd like to thank Phil, Nicola, Arjun, Mark, Jeff, John, and Dave belatedly for joining us quite late on. Thank you for that, Dave, for their time and expertise in preparing and delivering today's webinar. I hope it's useful. I just want to close with a few things I heard from patients around this comment, around this topic. Is the patient voice heard enough so we can learn from patients' experience? To be honest, no. Second comment, I think the policymakers should get out the message of the benefits of using data and the controls around that data so people feel better reassured. We need to create a clear and concise message on the benefits, risks, and how they'll be managed, creating a clear strategy for engaging patients and the public. And as a data user, most of our work relies on using data. It's important we are transparent about how we use our patient data. And you will see in the comments and the chats other quotations people put in. We'll encapsulate those and publish those on the web as soon as possible. So finally, thank you for everybody for attending, for your patience and for your great questions. I hope it was useful. I hope we'll see you at future webinars. If you want to join the Use My Data mailing list, you will get the details from there and my details over my shoulder. But many thanks to everybody for that, and wishing you a good rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.